Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support me, and the best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber. On the Substack, we do every week or two group Zoom chats with supporters only that are off the record, where we shoot the breeze on current events. I also do a weekly roundup and analysis commentary of the news in audio, video, and written format, and sometimes we bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A exclusive with them. You can donate through the website. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about anything, and I've got a bunch of affiliates you can check out. Leave a podcast review if you haven't already. And joining us is Nick Anthony to talk about my favorite subject, CBDCs. He's a policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives, a fellow at the Human Rights Foundation. His research covers a wide range of topics within the field of monetary and financial economics, including CBDCs, financial privacy, crypto, and the use of money in society. He's the author of Digital Currency or Digital Control, Decoding CBDC and the Future of Money, and his works have been published in Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, Business Insider, among other outlets. He's testified before Congress and maintains the HRF CBDC Tracker, which documents CBDC development and civil liberties concerns around the world. He's also got a Substack, bankingbureau.substack.com. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Nick.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I've been following your stuff for a while, and I read your bio. Is there anything you'd like to add, or any other project that we should know about?
Oh gosh. I think that's the majority of it. I always have different things going on, and right now it feels crazier than ever because there's new things around every turn, whether just in everyday life or on the international scale. But I think you nailed the majority of it.
All right, yeah, and the links are in the description so people can follow you on X, on your Substack, at the Cato Institute, get your book in physical or digital format, and check out your CBDC tracker. And maybe just to start, you're doing good work tracking, which tongue-in-cheek, what I'll call the crazy banksters demonic currency, CBDC, as I'll refer to it. And in your book, you talk about this moment in time may very well prove to be an inflection point in monetary and financial history. A CBDC could even become the most significant development in monetary and financial policy since the creation of the nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, just over a century ago. Where the creation of the Fed marked the end of competition and money in the US, the creation of a CBDC could mark far worse. Put simply, CBDCs jeopardize financial privacy, freedom, and markets. Worst of all, there are no unique benefits created by CBDCs to justify those risks. So maybe to start, would you agree that the cardinal Leviathan before us, the principal Goliath that taunts us daily, the greatest imminent threat to our freedom is the CBDC?
I think it really is. It's kind of unreal to think about that there is something that is looming before us that poses such a great threat and such a grave threat across the entire world. And yet it really is there. And it's something that most people have no idea anything about. To be fair, the last thing that we needed in economics or politics, frankly, was another acronym. But central bank digital currency, or CBDC, represents effectively governments having untold access and control over our financial lives, and that ricochets into everything. That goes into our political views, our charitable views, our religious views, where we travel, how we organize, everything we do. And it's something that's been building for a long time now, before the letters CBDC were ever put together. But we're really seeing all of the problems in the existing system, how they affect human rights, civil liberties, and the like, are being taken to another level with the creation of CBDCs.
Yeah, and if you could further, define CBDCs for us, there's a lot of folks that have been commenting on this. Richard Werner, I'm almost forgetting his name. I haven't looked at his stuff as of late, but he said that digital money has been around, kind of as you just alluded to, for a long time. Again, in your book, you say a CBDC would create a sort of digital tether between individuals and the central bank, allowing the bank to fully surveil transactions, program payments, seize money. And so just further, if you could tell us, what exactly sort of are CBDCs?
Well, from an economist point of view or from an academic point of view, a central bank digital currency is a digital national currency that is a direct liability of a country's central bank. But for all of us living our day-to-day lives, what this really just means is you have an account with the central bank. You have a financial account with the government, and they can see everything that you're doing with your financial transactions, how you spend, how you earn, and the like. And they can also intervene in those transactions. Like you said, digital money is not a novel thing today, whether it's tapping a debit or credit card, using a prepaid card, using cryptocurrencies. There are many options to transact digitally today. So it's not this breakthrough innovation in terms of technology, but what it is really a breakthrough in terms of advancing government's control over our financial situations. And like I said before, it's really something that has been building up over time and time again. The kind of anti-money laundering system or the know your customer system has been used to shut down protests, political rivals, activists, NGOs, and the like. And this sort of weaponization of the financial system constantly hits a barrier in that governments have to go to the banks and say, hey, we need this done. The banks, they'll often comply, but they'll say, okay, our legal team needs to review it. We need to make sure we're doing everything by the book, and then they'll get it sorted out. So there's this very small air gap of what we have now of this sort of protection, this buffer from centralized power. And the key difference with a CBDC is that it would close that. So just to give you one quick example, many people saw how in Canada a few years ago, protesters had their bank accounts frozen after being in the protest for weeks. At this point, the government finally said, we've had enough. We're shutting down their bank accounts to freeze funding so they can't get resources. Well, one of the things that the government had to do was invoke the Emergencies Act and use that authority to leverage the anti-money laundering system to order the banks to shut down these accounts. None of that would have been needed if this was a CBDC-based system. Instead, it would have been the government just saying, okay, yeah, close down all the accounts, freeze all payments, say, within a 10-mile radius of this protest, or freeze all the accounts in these affected zones in general. And that is a lot of power to have. It's really hard to fathom that because we go about our lives all the time with money being something that's in the background. It's the oil for the engine. But here we're seeing how whoever controls that oil really controls everything else.
Would you say, I mean, something that you're describing there, I would say this is unprecedented in all of human history. Like we've never seen this totality of control. Would you agree?
I haven't thought about it in that light, but I do think you're right. We have not seen this degree of centralization before in the public sphere. There have been grave threats in terms of centralizing data and centralizing surveillance in the back end in terms of more surveillance operations that have been happening in terms of collecting data here and there. But this is probably the most forward one has been in terms of putting it right up in our faces and saying, yes, we are going to watch everything you do. Yes, we'll be able to control what you do. Yes, we'll have the absolute say over everything, and you'll say thank you at the end. Usually in the past, governments have at least had the mindset that they shouldn't be so forward about that it's something that they should hide. But here it's strangely transparent. I welcome it because it makes it easier to criticize, but it's almost concerning in and of itself, some of the things that the leading proponents of this have been saying.
Yeah, and I'm just looking back all the way to history before the 1900s. Before we had digital technology in any country or empire. You had dissidents or whatever, and there was always cash, right? Physical money where people could use to survive. But my point was kind of like we're entering this realm where that might not be the case anymore. And before getting to some of the other aspects like Bitcoin, crypto, stablecoins, I just want to beat on this horse a bit more. And for people that are sort of on the fence or don't really grasp the danger here, I'd like to ask you, Nick, if I'm too paranoid or if the average person is too naive. Back in 2021, I was banned from Patreon, which I used to try and survive, to feed my family, to make money. In 2022, the Department of Homeland Security banned me from PayPal, which inhibited my ability to procure for my family, and yet I pay taxes to support them. And as you mentioned, people are increasingly being debanked around the world. I mean, in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, being banned from banking, from using money, and it's clear, I think, to me that this is not going to stop. That the governments and corporations will continue this trend forward. It doesn't seem like they've repented at all, neither like the Canadian government that you mentioned. And I fear a world where cash becomes sort of like an outlier or non-existent. We're relegated to using strictly digital payments, phone payments, only using CBDCs or stablecoins, whatever. I just feel, as you mentioned, anyone can just be unpersoned willfully or even accidentally, in a Kafkaesque sort of technocratic manner at the push of a button. So just any further thought on this sort of totalitarianism?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. You got so many different wheels turning. Let me try and hit a few of them. So one, on the question of paranoia versus being naive, I think you're right that a lot of people do not realize what's happening here. A lot of people have no understanding. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, they're only going to learn when they're caught up in a bad situation where suddenly all the gears are turning against them. And the current way the system is set up is for that knowledge to be missing. So a big part of what's called broadly the Bank Secrecy Act regime that allows a lot of that to happen in the United States, where the government is able to surveil transactions and control transactions, is kept secret. Under the US law, it is purely confidential. Citizens are not allowed to know that their bank is filing reports to the government on transactions. And I think that is extremely unfortunate, because then nobody knows just how bad this is. And frankly, a lot of Americans think that the Fourth Amendment protects their financial privacy when it hasn't done that in decades. That has not been the case. And they find this out and they're shocked. And it's no wonder. They're shocked because it was kept hidden from them. Maybe it's not technically a secret that the broader regime is in operation, but to the extent that it affects them, that is kept behind closed doors. So I think people do need a wake-up call, but I'd much rather it be this podcast and conversations like this than what you had to go through. On a broader note, though, on cash being available in the past, that's so important. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's something that is actively being taken off the table right now. Governments across the world have openly said, we want to reduce cash use or we want to eliminate cash. And CBDCs are the way to get there. Even the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, has said that countries should replace cash with CBDCs. Now, the United States and the European Union have taken slightly different paths to it. They've tried to say we would never replace cash. But even then, there's a need to be skeptical about it, because some of the arguments for CBDCs directly depend on the absence of cash. Just to give you a quick one, the argument for negative interest rates. requires that cash doesn't exist. So the government starts charging negative interest rates through the CBDC. If cash exists, people will get out of the system. They flee to cash, and then they don't have to worry about losing money, effectively getting fined by the government. So cash has to go. But then it's even worse than that, because cryptocurrency has to go. You can't have people fleeing from the CBDC to Bitcoin or to a stable coin or something else. And it gets even worse than that, because people can't flee then to, say, gold or silver or some other commodity. So you have, on one hand, and this is part of why I say in the book that there's really no benefits being brought forward, because on one hand, you have, okay, they have to remove everything, restrict our lives to almost an unbelievable level to achieve this touted benefit of CBDCs, or they maintain our freedom, and yet you can't even use it the way that its proponents were said it was going to somehow benefit us. And that seems like a lose-lose situation. And if those are the two choices, I frankly reject the option at all and say this is not a path that we should be going down. Unfortunately, a lot of central banks feel very, very differently. They've pushed forward nonetheless. The United States is now in a good place where President Trump has issued an executive order to say a CBDC won't be created. That needs to be codified into law, but still in a good place. Yet the European Union says, oh, well, that's a reason why we need to push forward even faster. And other countries around the world already have CBDCs, South Korea being really the latest of that to push forward and introduce a CBDC for the public to use.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, this argument they won't get rid of cash, I find completely disingenuous. You know, I've mentioned this story briefly before. I lived in Kazakhstan for a couple of years, and we went for vacation to Europe, France, Paris, and before I always use cash, and I converted my Kazakh tenge into euros at the bank in Kazakhstan. But because it's so remote, you know, they only get 500 euro bills. They're not going to have the little stuff because, I mean, it's just Kazakhstan at the end of the world. And I get, you know, a couple thousand and 500 euro bills, go to Paris, hotel, you know, wake up the next morning, go to lunch at some plaza, and paying in cash. I don't pay in card. And the waiter just looks at me like I'm an alien, handing him a 500 euro. He's like, oh, no. He literally thought I was a drug dealer or a terrorist. I'm like, it's a 500 euro bill. Like, they don't take it. They refuse, absolutely refuse. And we didn't have I don't recall how we paid, but I look around the plaza. There's like no banks, no ATMs, nothing. And my point here is that it's a long game that they play. So they say we won't remove cash, but you know, I live here in Mexico, and you just see increasingly people are just paying with their phones. They're paying with their cards, and so a majority of the population just ends up not using cash. And the limits just keep decreasing. Like I mentioned, you know, Europe and Mexico, they keep decreasing the limits for the amount of cash that you can use in a transaction. And so I think it's a long game that they're playing. And maybe to go a bit beyond CBDCs, you know, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, what are your thoughts there? What's going on there? There's all this talk about Bitcoin strategic reserves. You know, Michael Saylor, MicroStrategy, I kind of like see a lot of funky stuff going on there. They're talking about digitizing the dollar. Larry Fink, he just came out and stated Bitcoin could replace the dollar as a world reserve currency. So some people say, and I'm on the fence, that it's a pump and dump where they're trying to pump Bitcoin, and then it by hook or by crook, it could be a rug pull. Or they might succeed and digitize sort of the dollar and give it a new life, sort of like a Bretton Woods 3.0, where we had the gold-backed dollar, then the petrodollar, and now sort of a Bitcoin dollar. So what's interesting for you? If you could tell us, you know, what do you think is going on in the Bitcoin space and crypto space, and now how that interacts with CBDCs?
Well, just briefly, I do want to mention as well, there are the 500 euro cash limits in Greece, 7,200 euro cash units. Sorry, 7,200 euro cash limit in Latvia and the like. And here in the US, it's even difficult to just pay your taxes in cash. All the steps that they make you jump through if you want to pay your taxes in cash are absurd. And one of the first steps is just don't. The IRS says, don't pay us in cash. We don't want that. Go get like a prepaid card or find somebody who will send it in digitally. But on the Bitcoin front, I have many concerns, I have to say. I come at this, perhaps to no surprise, from a very libertarian perspective. And it's really the libertarian roots of Bitcoin that got me so interested in this space, figuring out something that can be created out of the private sector, that can be open to the public. We can have as much involvement with anyone around the world as we see fit, and you're free to enter and exit as you see fit. You get into a very strange place, though, when it's the government who is doing those actions. You get into a very strange place when one of the largest governments in the world, for that matter, has a deeply invested stake in the way that this is operating. So it's probably no surprise to anyone that's heard Bitcoin. They've probably heard also that the security of the system is based on how many people are involved, and that you have to do a 51-50 attack. You have to get this majority share to attack the system, which is frankly near impossible, but really we should say near improbable. And it gets less improbable when you have one of the largest governments in the world with one of the largest budgets in the world suddenly having a stake in it. I like the idea of the government having some skin in the game and that making it less likely that it'll be hostile. But at the same time, I don't like the idea of it seemingly trying to take over. And so it concerns me that we've drifted so far from those initial libertarian roots of creating money without the state into how can we get the state more involved than ever before. I don't mean to doomsday by any means. I think Bitcoin is well designed in that it can withstand a lot of pressure, but I also don't want to test the limits of that pressure. So I urge folks a lot of caution as they push forward with this to think about whether they're thinking in the long term or in the short term. I recognize there are some interesting arguments that folks say that this kind of stamp of approval will sort of pour fuel on the fire and get Bitcoin interest or adoption better than ever. I do see where they're coming from with that, but there's a lot of risks that come with this as well.
Thoughts on stablecoins? As I understand them, they're kind of like almost virtual digital representations of real currencies. You know, you've got like Tether and the U.S. sort of dollar, and there are people talking about how was it Tether makes up a majority of Bitcoin purchases, or it backs it through the treasury debt, and that again, this could be a house of cards that collapses. Or it could be the way to digitize the dollar and just, again, give it a new life. Some people have argued, I think even Saylor, that they want to demonetize gold, as a way to attack the East, the BRICS world, or vice versa. And so just any thoughts on what's going on in the stablecoin space?
I think there are a lot of really interesting advances in the stablecoin space. And I say that particularly because as we're talking right now, Congress is considering stablecoin legislation. But for me, what's more interesting is what's happening abroad. And we see people using stablecoins as a way to essentially unofficially dollarize get access to the dollars under heightened inflation or even hyperinflation. And I think that is extremely fascinating to see that opportunity unfold, especially because it's really been possible this whole time if there were lighter regulations or lighter controls on the traditional banking system. So seeing that manifest is really kind of amazing, and to see people get a sort of lifeline here that they didn't previously have. I do worry a little bit though, because there's a strange phenomenon happening where some central banks are trying to, I don't know if it's right to call it marketing or rebranding or what, but some central banks have taken to rebranding CBDCs as stablecoins. And that's a little strange to see. I know here in the United States, the state of Wyoming is trying to issue its own stablecoin, which creates a really weird gray area because sure, it might not be the central bank, but this is a government financial instrument essentially. And that's where it's very odd to see developments. And I'm not quite sure where those are leading, but I do hope people are paying attention and making sure, whether it's Circle, Tether, or the state of Wyoming, that people are paying attention to what they're using and making sure they understand what they're using, because it could be extremely different if it's a private sector offering versus a state offering.
Thoughts on altcoins and meme coins? Kind of my feeling is we've got official currencies of nations. You've got these now stable coins, and you've got the big players like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and I think XRP Ripple. And from there on down, you've got just this whole host of meme coins and altcoins. What's interesting for you there? Do you think those will eventually fall by the wayside, or increase, or just I think you commented on your X recently on Dogecoin. So thoughts on that space?
So no individual thoughts on specific altcoins, but I do think it's an interesting space that kind of gets cast away too quickly. A lot of Bitcoin maximalists say if it's not Bitcoin, then it's trash. Like, don't even bring it up in conversation. But I do think it's interesting to see the ebb and flow that happens in kind of the altcoin ecosystem to find out what is catching people's attention. It might be as simple, from at least my mindset, as being this one feature in this one altcoin is what's ultimately going to stand the test of time, and somebody's going to pull that out and put it into another system, and that'll catapult forward. So I think it is a nice kind of experimental area or sandbox of sorts, but it's not something that I would charge in and die on by any means.
Some of your recent posts over at the Cato website, you've been giving interviews on podcasts and radio and commenting on the Trump Treasury expanding financial surveillance. What just thoughts? What's going on here?
So I'm glad you brought this up, because this gets back to what I was saying before about how there's kind of that air gap with the current system. One of my colleagues at the Human Rights Foundation put it really well, saying we're kind of at this 80% level of surveillance, and CBDCs take it to 100%. And what's meant by that is really seen in this surveillance order. So the Treasury announced that it's going to start surveilling transactions at the border with Mexico, through 30 different zip codes. If you go to a money service business, so that's like Western Union, RIA Transfer, Casa de Cambio, or a few others that offer services to get money from the US to Mexico, check cashing and the like. If you go there and you spend more than $200, they're going to file a report on you to the government. And maybe to put this in perspective, I think it was the CEO of Casa de Cambio said they typically file about like 60 reports a month. He says he imagines that that's going to go up to like 5,000 reports. Because anytime someone sends $200, they now need to report the name, address, social security number, the currency breakdown, and also who it's going to the federal government. And $200 is shockingly bad. But this type of system happens around the US where it's at the $10,000 level. So anytime you make that transaction at a bank where you withdraw $10,000, maybe you're going to buy a car or something like that, that has to get reported to the federal government as well. And altogether in a year, banks and other financial institutions report about 20.1 million of these transactions. Altogether, under the Bank Secrecy Act, they report about 27 million transactions. And so that is that kind of realization or reminder that the current system does have a lot of problems. We do have surveillance problems. We do have financial control problems that are existing today without a CBDC being introduced. But a CBDC would make that much worse because then we're talking about trillions of transactions.
It's absolutely insane. I mean, $200 is nothing, and how they make it so cumbersome just for everyday, normal, innocent, law-abiding citizens to function.
I should add as well, it's actually worse than that because it's not technically $200. It's anything less than that as well. If they suspect that you're doing, say, $190 or maybe $150 to avoid getting reported. And this is something that happens all the time. People come in, they're, say, on their way to work to do this. The clerk pulls out, oh, since it's $200, we need to fill out this form. Person says, I'm already late for work. I can't do this, and leaves. Now they have to be reported not for a currency transaction, but for suspicious activity. And in the, again, taking data from the wider country at this $10,000 threshold, that's one of the number one reasons that people get reported for a suspicious activity report is not for crossing the $10,000 threshold for a currency transaction report, but getting close to that threshold because it's a crime that the government calls structuring. You're structuring your payments to avoid getting detected. And with that in mind, the government did say when it made this announcement saying we want you to start watching for transactions at $200, it said, by the way, don't forget, you should be reporting under that as well if you think they're trying to avoid it. And that is just such a mess. So it's $200 is the official line, but technically $190, $150, maybe $100 could get you in that place as well.
No, this is total insanity. And I like how you've sort of helped visualize for us that, you know, the move towards CBDCs, that we still have this 20% gap, stop gap or obstacle, but they're trying to remove that finally, so they have total control. But I want to ask you about, you mentioned the executive order banning CBDCs. I sometimes like to jokingly, you see China in the East, who's more authoritarian, technocratic. They have CBDCs, countries like that. And I kind of liken it to, do you want George Orwell 1984 or do you want Aldous Huxley Brave New World? So you got the one version is CBDC where the boot is on your face, CBDC, or the other version where the boot is still on your face, but you don't feel it because they've come at it from another angle. You kind of enjoy the boot in Brave New World, and I like to call it PBDCs, private bank digital currencies. People have said that, okay, he bans CBDCs in the US, but you can still have this private retail commercial system of digital currencies, stablecoins, cryptos that, if it goes too far enough, it wouldn't really be different. Take my example of the private companies of Patreon and PayPal, which debanked me at the behest of the government. So just any thoughts on PBDCs, as I like to call them?
I think you're absolutely right in that that is a very real concern. And maybe to spoil my book for anyone that's listening, please still go buy it. But at the very end, one of the things that I say is that even if we stop the rise of CBDCs, say we stop it across the board, we don't get to rest. The fight is still very much on because we need to fix all of the problems that are taking place currently, and problems like you experienced and like countless other people are experiencing, whether it's at the behest of the Financial Action Task Force, the Federal Reserve, or any other centralized player in governments being elected or otherwise. There are far too many examples of governments weaponizing the financial system and doing it increasingly so. So even if a CBDC is not launched, I very much believe that governments are still going to look at ways to force us into that path. They just might have to go a more roundabout measure. And that's part of what they did, really, by having the Bank Secrecy Act regime require banks to report people to the government. It was kind of a roundabout measure at this surveillance to get the banks to do it instead. And it could easily be increased at any moment. We've been fighting here at the Cato Institute to decrease all of that, to lower the amount of surveillance that's been taking place. Yet it could easily be expanded and have them say, oh yeah, you need to send this all to us by default, and we're in a very similar place. So I very much encourage people to continue the fight against CBDCs, but to keep in the back of their mind that we're not in a bastion of freedom. We have not been in that place for a very long time. And the way that the current system is set up, you can improve your life. You can go out of your way to take steps to make sure you're protecting your financial privacy, your financial autonomy, and your sovereignty. But you have to actively take those steps because there's a lot that's been going on in the background for a very long time that gets us, frankly, in a pretty scary place once you realize the degree of it.
No, we're frogs in the pot, and the pot is boiling, and it's not going all completely smooth for them. They are consistently advancing, but I feel like they feel they're behind schedule. Some projects they've had to delay for years, like the EU travel electronic authorization was supposed to be implemented last year. Now it's been pushed back to 2027. And that links to what we're talking about, because October this year, Lagarde mentioned they're activating the digital euro. And at that same moment, they're activating the exit entry system where they take your biometrics once you enter Europe. So that's linked your mobility with the digital money and the permission to travel to Europe. Now you need a visa for your visa. And they talk about, Schengen and making it easier to travel. It's like, we're going backwards. What are you talking about? We're regressing. They've delayed that to 2027. But I wanted to ask you, Efrat Fenningson just posted today. She's the Israeli Bitcoiner podcaster, this story about South Korea trialing a CBDC with 100,000 users and 7 banks. The pilot started just a few days ago, and it's ending at the end of June. Participants will be able to convert their bank deposits to tokens and use them for payments at selected merchants. 7-Eleven stores will accept CBDC payments, providing a 10% discount on all products paid for with CBDC during this period. Many other stores like Hyundai Home Shopping, Kyobo Bookstore. Here in Mexico, where I am, in the second largest city in Mexico, Guadalajara, I remember some years ago, they Hoosies, I think it was called Hoosies. So they did a similar trial. It sounds exactly the same, where they deployed Hoosies, these like social credit points or tokens, and they onboarded various businesses in Guadalajara. And if you did what they told you, like jogged, didn't use cars, if you cycled, if you did certain things, you would collect Hoosies, which then you could use to buy food or get discounts at these different retailers. And then we've got the issue I'm sure you're familiar with in Nigeria, where Nigeria, I believe it was Nigeria, the e-Naira, they just tried to brute force it, and banks was lit on fire. Then they eliminated cash, and then they brought it back, I think. And so that was chaos. Just thoughts on some of these stories that you're tracking?
It's good that you brought up Nigeria, because we're kind of seeing history repeat itself in South Korea. Back in December, the South Korea actually increased its workforce for the first time in probably a decade, ahead of rolling out this central bank digital currency there. And it's interesting to see this kind of 10% discount idea being part of the adoption plan, because that's also what happened in Nigeria. They tried to offer discounts at first because nobody was using it. 0.5% of the 220 million person population. That's abysmal in terms of a central bank offering a new product. And so they offered discounts. Those didn't work. They offered to open it up to people without bank accounts, because it is a very high rate of unbanked people in Nigeria. That didn't work either. And then they started pulling cash off the streets. They were limiting withdrawals from ATMs, and then ultimately said, I believe if I'm remembering this correctly, there was a 3-month notice that all the cash on the streets would expire in January, because they wanted to replace it with new bills, which is something that happens, to be fair. That's something that happens where new designs are put in, maybe a new face, a security strip, or something else. But you don't do that to 220 million people in 3 months. And what was especially telling about what happened was after the fact. After they created a cash shortage, as people waited in line to get the new cash, and lines turned to protests when banks didn't have enough cash, and protests turned to riots as people ended up getting desperate because they just couldn't buy anything. After that was all settled, Central Bank Governor Godwin Emefiele said the e-Naira had emerged as the electronic currency of choice. He said it was the choice of the people to adopt this, because adoption rose from 0.5% to 6%. First off, that is not a success story by any means, but at the very least, it is not a success story to go from 0.5% adoption to 6% adoption. But also, it is not the people's choice to do that. It is clearly an act of desperation, people just trying to survive, if that's the circumstance that you bring this forth. And right now, we're only 2 or 3 days now into the South Korean pilot, but I see the same story being echoed, where sure, they'll roll it out, they'll have discounts, they'll probably eventually do giveaways of some sort, but it fails to recognize that, like we said at the very beginning of this conversation, digital currency is not a new technology today. We are in the year 2025. Digital currency has been around for quite a while in different shapes and forms, to be fair, but people are often well suited or well served by the market. They don't need the central bank swooping in to save them. And so if it's not offering any benefits to us, then the only other person in this equation that it can be offering benefits to is the government. And that's just not something that we should be welcoming with open arms, whether it's, again, South Korea, Nigeria, or elsewhere. It's not something that anyone should be welcoming in.
Yeah, and I think we should put a premium on privacy and just reject their attempts. Like even here, I can't tell you how many times I go to a convenience store or supermarket and they ask for my phone number to buy bread, and I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" No, and because you get discounts because you get the point cards, but then they create a social credit profile that goes to all the data brokers, and then it's a social credit system, and I'd rather pay more. I'm not going to take the bait. And it's kind of, as you're saying, they give you the carrot first. Oh, you don't want the carrot? Okay, here comes the stick. And let me also ask you about, real quick, do you see, there's been talk about this, I think, by Trump's son, what's his name now? Not
Eric Trump.
Right, that they are talking about, using cryptos as a U.S. citizen is onerous, the tax reporting obligations. This is why I barely, I don't do it. I take donations, and
Yeah.
I cash them out, and I report it and all that. But
Yeah, I
I'm just
do not blame you at all. It's an absolute mess, and it's specifically designed. Or let me not jump the gun, but I'll say just briefly, it's specifically designed to essentially make it as hard as possible, and it disincentivize any competition with the dollar. But sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, yeah. And do you think there's been talk? Do you think they'll do away with some of these regulations to make using cryptos just more smooth, or do you think we're just in this battle right now?
Oh gosh. So I would very much like to see, at the very least, the capital gains tax requirement removed for transactions where you're buying or selling goods and services. If you're using it as money, to remove that, because it's just unbelievable the hoops you have to jump through for spending just a few sats, essentially, a few dollars in Bitcoin. And it's specifically, as I was saying, it's specifically designed, really, or implemented to make it as hard as possible and to disincentivize any sort of alternative currency use, any sort of currency competition, because governments want to maintain their monopolies over money, and so they put up these barriers. And one place that we've seen it happen is with what's often considered kind of the exemption for foreign currency. If you go on vacation and you come back to the United States with, say, 200 euros or 200 pesos, or rather, let me correct that, $200 worth of euros or pesos, then you don't have to file taxes on the gains. That's considered an exemption. And there have been a lot of moves to create legislation that would do the same thing for $200 worth of spending with any cryptocurrency. I would like to see that number much higher, but it is a start, and it is something that would ultimately benefit everyone working in the cryptocurrency space. Now, whether it's going to happen anytime soon, I'm not sure. This has been an idea that I have to give credit to Coin Center, a think tank here in DC. They've been pushing this issue for years now, and they've gotten a lot of really good support around it, but it still hasn't crossed the finish line. Maybe now is the time, because we have an administration that is more optimistic about the future of cryptocurrency, and we have more people really than ever that are in tune to this issue. But it's still so difficult to get it there, and frankly, it goes against most of the incentives that government actors have. I'm sure even if it does get close, then people at the Federal Reserve or people at the Treasury are going to be coming into Capitol Hill. They're going to be knocking on doors saying, you cannot do this. We can't let you do this. By God, please do not do this, because it would take down a major barrier to cryptocurrency use, at least in terms of using it as everyday money.
I pulled out, just for this interview, my Mises and the Fed coffee mug. But yeah, Mexican billionaire Hugo Salinas Price, he tried for years. He worked with Mexican senators to pass legislation to make silver legal currency alongside the Mexican peso. From my understanding, the Bank of Mexico didn't want it, and I'm sure the Fed they're linked with the Bank of Mexico. They stopped that. Same idea here with Bitcoin and crypto. And two final questions, I guess, for you. Number one, what do we do? What do we do? How do we resist this digital dictatorship?
Well, the first thing I want to stress for people is to know the importance of alternatives. Recognize how important it is that we do have options. We might not exercise all of our options, but we should not forget that they are there. And I don't just mean Bitcoin or Monero or Tether or any other cryptocurrency. I mean, even paper dollars, cash in your hand is an alternative to this. Frankly, even a bank account is an alternative to this. Bank accounts, checks, prepaid cards, cryptocurrencies, payment apps, all of these things are alternatives to the government running our financial system. And it's so important that we recognize the value of them, because all too often in history, the value of alternatives is only recognized once they're lost. And it is very hard to reclaim the freedoms that we have lost. So make sure, to any listeners who want to resist this, make sure you know what your alternatives are, what options are on the table, what escape routes you have, escape hatches and lifelines are at your disposal. It's so easy to forget them, especially when living in a modern economy where things are so seamless. The next really big thing in terms of branching out from resisting as an individual is resisting as a group. And really that comes down to talking to other people. I can't thank you enough for having me on the show to talk about this, because frankly, most people don't know what a CBDC is. Maybe they think it's something to do with cannabis because they hear CBD. Maybe they think it's the CDC and it's a health issue. But CBDC is not only an unwieldy acronym, but a foreign one to most people. So just going out, telling a friend to tell a friend what a CBDC means for the future of the financial system, for the future of human rights, and for the future of civil liberties makes a big difference, because it's only through that we can, at the very least, temper what comes next, but hopefully stop it. Otherwise, central banks are going to push forward regardless of what we have to say. If it's only a few people muttering it in a corner of a room, nothing's going to change. But when we start getting folks on podcasts, on TV, on radio, papers are published, people are talking about this at town halls, people are calling their elected representatives to say they're concerned, then change starts to happen. I encourage folks to go on with the Human Rights Foundation. I've built a CBDC tracker at hrf.org/CBDC tracker, and just look at how much has happened, how much this has spread. And if we continue to, or rather, if people continue to not know about this subject, the map is quickly going to turn red all the way around. One last thing I'll say, in addition to knowing the value of alternatives, raising awareness of this issue, both in local communities and wider communities, is also to just constantly stay in a, as tiring as it may be, a somewhat skeptical state, because there's a lot of information that's thrown at us these days, and not all of it is presented fairly. Not all of it is presented in the right way. Frankly, it's why in my book, I start by handing out the benefits that proponents say CBDCs have. I didn't want to start with the doom and gloom of mass surveillance and control. I wanted to give a fair shot and say, these are all the amazing things that they say are going to happen, that it's going to improve our lives through this better monetary policy, this better financial inclusion, and the like. Unfortunately, not everyone will offer that. And so it's always important to be skeptical, whether it's CBDCs or something else. Always make sure that you're asking questions about what's taking place, and also asking questions about who's providing this information, because the world, frankly, is a messy place, and there's just no escaping that.
Doom and gloom. My final question for you, I'm not so optimistic. I don't think ultimately a type of system like this is forever sustainable. I think it would eventually devolve back into what happened in Nigeria, but we could go through a world. I mean, the Soviet Union wasn't sustainable, but it lived on for multiple decades. And a lot of people were killed, imprisoned, impoverished. But speaking on the doom and gloom, let's say they do succeed to strong degrees implementing the cashless society, the mark of the beast. Have you contemplated ideas and how to survive within such a system? I've had a number of guests on. You mentioned Monero, Aaron Day. I've interviewed. He talks about getting out of fiat and using prepaid cards and Monero and Zano and different private cryptos and things like that. But the thing that often comes to mind as well, at least, being trying to be as self-sustainable as you can, resilient, not dependent on their systems. If you can, have a farm or a plot of land where you got at least water and you can grow food. So if they do debank you, you can still continue on. Just any thought on surviving in the district in Hunger Games?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. If it gets to that point, having the ability to take care of yourself is something that sadly has been lost. I mean, it a little bit, it gets to what I was saying about alternatives and knowing the alternatives that are there. A lot of people don't value these alternatives because of how seamless the existing system has become. In the same way, a lot of people don't know how to really take care of themselves absent all of the amenities we have. And so I think you make an important point that people do need to keep in mind. How do I take care of myself in these extreme situations? I don't think everyone needs to go buy a full bug out shelter and the like, but everyone should have some basic knowledge of how to take care of themselves in an extreme situation, because just like most people don't know most people don't know the value of alternatives until those alternatives are taken away from them. Most people are not going to know the value of being self-sustainable until that's lost. And trust me, it is much harder to learn how to farm when you're hungry than when you have a full belly. Waking up at the crack of dawn to tend to everything is much easier when you have a full stomach. And so it's not an easy thing to pick up, but it is something people should have a working knowledge of. Beyond that, I think people should look into what are the options that take place? What is at their disposal? How much do they depend on outside forces? So how much can you live off of in, say, a 10-minute radius of where you are, and what do you need to change that? Hopefully we don't get to that point where that becomes the make it or break it line, but I do think that that's important and fits well within kind of the idea of make sure you have a full picture of what's around you and not just this limited kind of day-by-day routine going on repeat until the end of time, because you never know when you might get kicked off your routine, whether in the system we have today or one of tomorrow.
Hey, 2020, you never know when they lock you inside of your homes and force you to use QR codes and digital passports. The book, Digital Currency or Digital Control, all of your links are in the description. But again, if you want to let us know the best places platforms on which to follow you.
Well, folks can find me probably most actively on X at Econ with Nick. You can also find me at Banking, Bureaucracy, and Beyond on Substack, and also find a lot of my work on the HRF CBDC Tracker. That's at hrf.org/CBDC Tracker.
All right. Well, we'll keep up the great work, Nick, and thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you for having me here. It's been great.